when one sits with a person with bipolar disorder, it's important to remember that they're a human being like you and I.
If you're not bipolar, you don't have the luxury to feel what they feel. One time I had a female patient who came to me, and I'd seen her a couple of times. And here I am, a novice, and don't really know what I'm asking or what I'm about to create in the patient. And she kept crying and crying and crying, and I said, after session after session, finally I said, I really understand how difficult this is for you, how painful this is. And I remember she looked at me, and she kind of squatted down and she said, you'll never, ever know what this feels like.
Tonight, if there's anything to describe how I'm feeling, I guess it's alone. Alone and wondering how I got here. Because I didn't want to be here. This is the last place I ever wanted to be at. And I wouldn't want anyone to be in this place.
When I first meet somebody who has bipolar disorder, one of the first things is to give them a bit of an education about it. I like to help them distinguish between depression and bipolar disorder. Depression being when the electric wires in our brain, just like the electric wires in the house, are moving through the brain, each one of these being a nerve. There are gaps called synapses, and in depression, the chemical that flows across this gap becomes in short supply, the particular chemical being serotonin. Very differently than that, in bipolar disorder, the neuron itself has a problem. It has a leaky sheath. The sheathing is mylar, and that becomes worn away or not replaced. And imagine that each of my fingers is a neuron. As a signal tries to come down here, it's going to bleed off into these other signals. So it's a little like if the bipolar person tries to raise their hand, they raise everything all at once.
When the bipolar personality is in the psychotic realm, they're in a world of fantasy. We have the ability to fantasize as a normal neurotic, but we can't stay there. I mean, for us, it's more called daydreaming or fantasy that is, it's still based in reality. But the bipolar personality doesn't have to have too much to do with reality when they're in the psychotic state.
Even though not all of the variables studied in bipolar disorder are accounted for by genetics, it seems to me that the person is different because they had bipolar disorder. So in much the same way that the family of origin has a huge influence on the person's personality development, so does the fact that they had bipolar disorder and were struggling with that.
I had gone from having 2 best friends to no friends, and also everyone in my grade hating me. So that didn't make me feel very good. It really messed me up, you know.
But in our working with people with bipolar disorder, we noticed that some of them are primarily manic and some of them are primarily down. Some people have a mixture and they cycle between the two. So we refer to be able to communicate to one another. We refer to primary manic presentations as bipolar 1, primarily down presentations as bipolar 2.
A friend of mine many years ago was definitely bipolar, but he was in the neurotic realm when I met him, and he was charming. As a matter of fact, he was extraordinarily charming and fun to be with, and he just made the room light up, and it felt like the room was alive the moment he walked in, the tension or the energy, but it was that fun energy. And I guess he felt he was a little indestructible, and then one day he was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And that diagnosis moved him into an entirely different realm than the neurotic part of bipolar. He moved into the psychotic part because I don't think he could really grasp, due to his own level of grandiosity, which is evident in bipolarism, I don't think he could really grasp that something was going to end, that he was going to end. And at that time, his behavior became so chaotic, so full of, so different from who he had been before he moved into that realm. It was almost like you didn't know him.
A person who comes with bipolar disorder, that is not, in my mind, their primary issue. Their primary issue is the same as it is for you and I, and that is to become present to ourselves, to not be alone and alienated any longer.
There's this woman who describes the bipolar disease very accurate, that you're on a boat on the ocean by yourself, and in one hand you're holding the anchor, which is in the bottom of the ocean. In the other hand, you're holding a kite, which is your hypomania or manic state. And you're on this boat, and you have to hold on really tight both ends and try to balance it on a boat. That was a brilliant metaphor for how it's like.
I think that the analysis helps people become present to themselves. And we all struggle with the division, the fundamental division of our superego, that voice inside of us beating up on us, and being self, separate from that voice. When one has bipolar disorder, one has one more reason to be separate. The analytic work can help the person stand back and observe rather than get caught up, so the tail quits wagging the dog, so to speak.
I was diagnosed in 2010 with bipolar disorder. I was 20 years old at the time, and I was diagnosed at the psych ward in Lincoln, Nebraska, after I had had a severe manic episode. Oh golly gee. I don't know how deep I want to get with this, but I'm kind of trying to just let it out. So whatever happens, happens.
Someone who has the bipolar personality disorder is most likely it's the depressive state. When they go to get medications from a psychiatrist, they are given a medication that makes them feel, to them, rather flat. Now actually what that means is they feel like us, and they don't particularly like that. They prefer the ability to be grandiose. And the way I think about it is that the level that they're able to become grandiose is also the level that they're able to become depressed. The outpatient unit was essentially triage at that time from inpatient to the community. So we were kind of a way station. And we got patients who were really actually not even settled into their medication. At that time, the medication was pretty hefty. It was usually Thorazine or Haldol, and those medications at that point were really powerful, so that who would want to take them because they made you feel as though you were halfway in the world.
Okay, so I had this crazy ass week. I was so in the clouds because I'd started 2 medications, something for my migraines, take every day, and Haldol. which was off. Apparently they didn't like me banging my head against the floor, so they gave me some Advan and some Haldol, and then there was also those new meds for my head, and then I was gone cuckoo.
When the bipolar personality is given medication, and usually they'll go in for medication when they're in the depressive state. And so the medication usually will work until they are no longer in that state, or at least they're no longer thinking they're in that state, because what we see and what they're feeling are not necessarily the same thing.
They have lived their lives experiencing the daily moments with a certain feeling that is unfinished business for them, and they want to recreate that feeling. In some cases, particularly manic cases, it's like being on an amphetamine, and they can get so much more done, sometimes sleeping 2 hours a day, producing a great deal, and to be on the medications feels artificial and slowed down to them. They, just like we feel like we're immortal and exempt from things like automobile accidents as we drive down the road, they feel like they can go off their meds and be exempt from the consequences.
They go off their med, they reach that high. The high can continue for a day, or it can continue for years. If that's the case, if it does continue for years, then that depression that mirrors the high is extraordinarily low. And I believe that when it is extraordinarily low, that people are more susceptible to other illnesses. Unfortunately, like all personality disorders, we're not indestructible, and unfortunately more so for the bipolar personality. They have more of a chance of moving into that realm. Sometimes they come back, but sometimes they don't.
I don't have an answer to that particular question. Ask me that again.
But they do have a shot. And another interesting thing about bipolar is that they,
Riders on the storm.
bleh.
Riders on the storm. Into this house we're born. Into this world we're thrown.
You and I not being depressed, if we were to take the antidepressant, there would be no change in our behavior. Which brings up
There's a killer on the road. His brain is squirming like a toad. Take a
If I don't look pretty, you're fucked.